Thank you for joining us for Community Planning Conversations today. I'm Patsy Petrie, and our conversation today is on a perfect topic since we had almost 3 inches of rain yesterday in 2 hours. I've invited John Jackson to join me and talking about green solutions or sustainable solutions in handling stormwater management in our community and his experience on projects throughout the United States. John Jackson is with Ratio Architects Incorporated. They have an office in Indianapolis where John is located, and they also have an office in Champaign right across from City Hall. So John, thank you very much for making the trip over today to talk to me. And just as an added aspect, John is also going to be doing a presentation this evening, a more formal presentation rather than our informal conversation that we will be having on how you design a system of rain gardens as a form of stormwater management instead of putting in infrastructure. And that's going to be in the Champaign City Council chambers, and it is going to be broadcast live but then taped and shown again, and that's on the PEG Channel 5. Again, John, thank you very much for joining me today. And
thanks for having me.
As I indicated, we just had almost 3 inches of rain yesterday in 2 hours, and personally I was out there fighting the buildup of water massively. Right. So a clear lead-in question is, what can all of us be doing to help pull back that massive amount of rain that came in such a short time in our soil, as probably over in Indianapolis too, because the weather tracks right across east from here, and the soil is not super saturated, but it was pretty saturated. And what can we start doing to kind of mitigate and manage some of this?
Well, that's a great question, and it so much of it can start just right at the home or on your personal property. You know, for decades the paradigm, I guess, has been to get rid of water as quickly as possible, of course, and there are a lot of benefits of doing that. Obviously, if you can shed water away from your home and so forth, you have less risk of your basement flooding and all those kinds of things. But as a society, we've sort of taken that idea and really blown it so far out of proportion, in terms of getting water to inlets as quickly as possible and into sewers and so forth, that of course, what tends to happen is we create larger problems for ourselves downstream. So, some of the things that can be done right at home are, I think many people have heard now about, rain barrels, of course, that can be just sort of tied into downspouts in your home. And while that may only be 55 gallons of water or something like that, when you start thinking about applying an idea like that very broadly across quite a number of homes in a community, that can start to add up. The other thing that I'm going to talk about quite a bit this evening on a more sort of urban scale or maybe commercial scale is the idea of rain gardens. But that's an idea that can also be applied to the residential setting as well. Anything that can be done to to just sort of limit the time it takes for water, from when water runs off of a roof or a driveway or even a backyard. Anything that can be done to slow that down before it gets into a storm sewer system is ultimately going to be beneficial.
So a rain garden could go also in a schoolyard or a church grounds or industry.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
And other things that can be done?
Green roofs are another option. A little bit more difficult to do on sloping roofs, I think, which is more typical of kind of a residential setting. But on commercial properties, where oftentimes the roof of commercial buildings are flat or generally flat, green roofs can be used to grab that first quarter, half inch of water and slow that down, capture some of it, prior to just rushing into the storm system.
But I think a lot of people think of green roofs as being so difficult and the potential of leaking. How has
Right.
the science and experience of building them progressed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of people, when you say green roofs, they imagine, 1 or 2 feet of soil or something like that on top of your roof and having to go up there and water it or something like that. And certainly things like that have been done, but there are some sort of pre-manufactured systems out there now that have become, quite sophisticated in sort of the growing medium and the way that they're installed and the kinds of plants that are used in them that make it really, very easy to do and quite safe in terms of water infiltration or something like that. There's one particular product called Live Roof that our experience suggests, appears to be sort of the most user-friendly product out there. I'm sure there are many others, but this one, comes in trays that are sort of standard-sized trays. I want to say they're about 2 feet by 4 feet or something. And the growing medium is really quite light, and in fact, there's very little actual soil in there.
So more of vermiculite.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And kind of a mineral sort of growing medium as opposed to soil. And the plants that are used are sedums, which are succulent plants, which means that they retain water for long periods of time, and they
don't need more water.
Exactly, they're very drought resistant. So it's not as though you have to be up there every day watering this thing. There's an establishment period, and then it kind of takes care of itself. So.
And besides holding back water when we have one of those gushing rainstorms, or even a non-gushing rainstorm, does it do anything else to keep buildings cool?
There's a little bit of insulation value that you receive from that, although my understanding is it's not a lot. It's not so much that would be the only reason to use it.
Okay. All right.
But certainly if you can prevent sort of direct sunlight from hitting a roof, that's gonna help a lot with your heating and cooling.
That load
Right.
That goes on. And what about such things as permeable surfaces and cisterns?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that a lot of people are talking about these days is permeable concrete. And that's something that we've used on a couple of our projects. It's relatively new to us. I work out of an office in central Indiana. It's relatively new to central Indiana. But it is something that seems to be gaining some traction in terms of an opportunity. And permeable concrete is concrete that essentially has very little fines in it, very few fines. It's mostly the rock and aggregate in concrete with the paste that kind of holds it all together. But there are a lot of voids in the concrete.
Think of it like Swiss cheese.
Exactly, yeah. So you could dump a 55-gallon barrel of water out onto a permeable concrete pavement, and it just kind of goes right through it. And then there are calculations that you do to sort of determine how much rock base below that concrete pavement section you need in order to store the water. And soil permeability factors into that and all kinds of things. But that's probably, currently the most popular thing that tends to be showing up in terms of an option for sort of capturing water right at its source.
Let me ask a question I know our viewers are going to want to ask, and that is, can that be used on a very heavily traveled street, or is it used more for driveways and arterial streets and church parking lots?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
What are you finding the usefulness level?
Yes, it is something that where you have very heavy trucks that may be turning tires, like in a loading dock area or something like that. Probably not somewhere that you want to use this stuff, from what we've heard. Where we have applied it is in sort of the parking spaces on a parking lot. And maybe having asphalt as the drive aisle or concrete, but in parking spaces there's a little bit you've sort of gotten yourself lined up with that space. There's less turning movement right on that pavement. But yeah, it's really quite durable stuff, more so than you would think. I mean, it sort of doesn't sound very strong.
A lot of people are worried about that aspect of it, so it's good to hear
Right.
that there is a durability to it.
Absolutely, and the question that comes up a lot when we bring this up to owners is, well, what about freeze thaw? I mean, this is the Midwest. Water gets in there, it gets trapped. I mean, doesn't that tear the pavement apart? And what we found and what we're hearing from concrete experts is, when it's designed correctly, there won't be any water in there because you're designing a base that can receive the water that's flowing through it.
It goes through.
Yeah, and it's so permeable to begin with that even if it gets 50% of the open spaces within the section are clogged up, it's still able to take an incredible amount of water. So much less of an issue than you would think. But there are some very particular requirements related to how it's installed.
The bed
yeah,
that you talked about.
And in the pavement section itself, you really need to have somebody who knows what they're doing and who's sort of certified to do it, because it can go poorly really quickly. It's such a stiff mix of concrete that you don't have much time to sort of work it and get it figured out and everything. So you have to kind of be right the first time.
And do it. And for those watching, if you want to see some examples of this locally, Hendrick's House, that's on the corner of Green and Lincoln, in their addition, in their parking lot addition, they've used this kind of concrete. And so has Faith Methodist Church on South Prospect.
Oh, that's great.
So there's some local examples. And then longer term examples, the parking lots at Illinois State University have had this kind of surface for probably 5 years now. So
that's great.
For those of you who are curious about this, it has some longitudinality as to the wear and tear that John was talking about. So let me ask you, how do you know all of this? What is your educational background?
Well, I'm a landscape architect, and I graduated from the University of Illinois in 1989 here in town. And so as a landscape architect, I guess we just find ourselves always sort of needing to think about water. What water is doing, how we're using it on site, and again, we very much used to approach water as sort of a bad thing that you need to get rid of as soon as possible. And that is kind of the current paradigm now. But as our firm was offered a number of different opportunities throughout our career, we found that it became sort of interesting to think of water differently, a different kind of paradigm where instead of treating water as a problem, really treat it as the resource that it is. Of all the water on Earth, one of the facts I'm going to sort of throw out there this evening, only 2.5% is fresh water. And another way to think of it is, if all the water on Earth were fit into a gallon jug, about 1 teaspoon of all that water would be the fresh water we have. So you start thinking about things like that, and you realize, water really is a resource, and it should be, thought of differently, cared for in a different way than we have been. But our firm started working with sort of different ways of addressing water quality and quantity issues about 10 or 12 years ago. We were doing some business park master planning in Indianapolis, and we had become kind of tired and leery of sort of the typical solution of kind of kidney-shaped detention ponds scattered around an office park site, and really wanted to
resident geese.
Yes, exactly, with its attendant populations of geese, and so we began to just try and challenge ourselves a little bit to think differently about it. We got involved in a project at one point that was a technology park. Called Intech Park in Indianapolis, and that was sort of the first opportunity we had to really treat the water as a resource. We kind of changed that paradigm of different ponds scattered throughout the site, brought them together in sort of one central kind of water feature that was a series of constructed wetlands that would spill over weirs and into a basin and so forth. And it really became kind of an amenity at that point rather than just a facility, a stormwater facility.
I don't want to lose your track on your projects because we want to talk about those a little bit more. But before we move too far away from the rain barrels that you talked about, I do want to let our viewers know that the City of Champaign is offering a rain barrel rebate program of $25 per barrel, and I think it's a maximum of 2 barrels per household. And Bee Lime, the store Bee Lime, is participating. The folks who sell the rain barrels at the local farmers market, and the Conservation Association of Champaign County also is selling rain barrels. So it's a nice start. And John mentioned they're roughly about 55 gallons, but if you start adding up even 2 per household, and if you put in 4 downspouts at each corner, and the drainage area that where we have terrific flooding along John Street, which is actually a covered river, and this is what started all of this and why we've invited John to come over and talk about it, on how we can solve some of these problems. Well, this is over 1,700 households, so you multiply that, even if you take 2 rain barrels per household, that's 3,400 rain barrels times, let's say, 50 gallons, to make the math easy. You've held back quite a bit of water.
Absolutely.
And even though you don't think 55 gallons is much, but as you pointed out, and I just wanted to underline, it's additive, and it really can make a difference.
Exactly. And you know, you figure you're probably using that water on your garden or lawns or whatever after the storm event is over at some point. And so then they're empty, presumably, you know, the next time it rains. And that's important to note, because, you know, that's where a lot of the problem is in the first few minutes of a big downpour.
Yes, we've all been reminded.
the peak on the hydrograph, you know, jumps way up in those first few minutes. And if you can, you know, engineers, you know, talk a lot about knocking the peak off that hydrograph with these kinds of facilities. So.
Well, and actually another little side bit, but we won't dwell on this, that those who are so very clever can replumb this back into their house to be used in their washing machine or with their toilets.
Absolutely.
And with new construction, that becomes even easier, and that's where a cistern can come into play, because they're just, about 4 times the size of a rain barrel, or varying sizes.
Yes, varying sizes, but lots of water. Yeah.
Lots of water. They can be below ground and above ground, right?
Sure, yeah.
Right. Well, I want to get back to your projects that you were talking about. I know you have some pictures which are worth 1,000 words. Not that you're going to stop talking, but if we could show some of those alternative ways of mitigating stormwater that you were describing in your projects.
Okay.
That would help the viewers get a better sense of this.
Great. Well, the first one that is on the screen right now is actually, it's not a project that Ratio designed, but it's one of a number of precedents that I'm going to present this evening from the city of Portland. While the climate and so forth and soils and all that are different in Portland, they've done a number of things and sort of stuck their neck out in many ways and experimented with rain gardens so much that it's hard not to talk about some of the things, or many of the things that they've done, you know, when you're talking about alternative stormwater management strategies. There's a lot to be learned out there for all of us.
They have a lot of rain.
They do. They have a lot of rain, and they happen to have soils that are very permeable, in particular on the east side of the city. So that helps a great deal. Champaign and Urbana, the soils here are not going to be as permeable. However, I think there's still some lessons to be learned here. But the image on the screen is a residential block in Portland that is sort of the site of one of their very first pilot projects for rain gardens. This was a 10,000 square foot watershed. And what they did... Can
you help people get some sense of what a 10,000 square foot watershed is?
Well, it's probably, in this particular case, it was about the one block, a residential block. So 450 feet or so is about the length of a block, and then the width of the street. So. So this is Northeast Siskiyou Street in Portland, and that's an existing sort of condition there.
So this is an after the fact. It's not a development.
That's correct. This is a
Okay.
retrofit.
Okay.
Exactly. This is an image of what it looked like after they implemented the rain gardens, and the rain gardens are sort of forward in the image and to the left and right side. What they did was they simply sort of pulled the curbs towards the center of the street. They took out a number of parking spaces and then created these depressions that they put permeable soil and plant material into. And these depressions sort of occur, if you can make that out, they occur upstream of the inlets that the water was flowing to.
Okay.
And so the way this works now is that instead of just flowing right down the gutter line and into an inlet, all the water in this watershed is sort of intercepted by these rain gardens. And there's a series of check dams and so forth and plant material in there.
Why don't you explain check dams?
Oh, check dam is just a small sort of a mound of earth, and in this case they covered it with rock. But the purpose of it is just to slow the water, give the water some time for the suspended solids in it to settle out a little bit and to percolate down into the soil. So this was, I saw a presentation. Here's a sort of a plan enlargement of what those look like, a little bit more detail. You can see some arrows indicating how water moves through it.
Now, do you need to bump it out, or could you create the same concept just using the curbing along
Yes.
the streets?
Absolutely. You can either go out towards the center of the street, or you can sort of put them inside or outside of the street, sort of on the sidewalk side.
Okay.
And there are a number of examples I've got from Portland of that as well. So either way appears to be very effective. The interesting thing is that, I saw the individual who designed many of these initial projects for the city of Portland give a presentation a couple years ago, a guy by the name of Kevin Perry, who was employed by the city at the time. And I found it all very interesting. It was attractive and so forth. But the thing that kind of made me take notice of this was the amounts of water that they were able to keep out of the storm system was really quite remarkable. I mean, they're realizing something on the order of 80 and 90% sort of reduction in the flow of water to storm sewers. And
why don't you talk about why that's so important?
Sure. Well, in Portland, like many cities, their city was designed with a combined sewer system, which means that the stormwater and the sanitary flows all sort of came together into one system. That, in turn, when it gets overloaded, ends up in many cases spilling into rivers, and when the system gets too overloaded, you often have sort of raw sewage just going right into rivers. So the EPA has mandated that cities with these combined sewer overflow systems fix that problem, separate the two systems. And cities are spending...
run two separate pipes down
Two
the
separate
street.
pipes,
Okay.
right, exactly. And cities are spending, as you can imagine, these are very old systems. There's a lot of things built on top of them and so forth, streets and sidewalks and everything. And cities are measuring the cost of needing to address this problem in the billions of dollars. And so when Portland began to sort of realize the magnitude of this problem, I guess, in the early 90s, the very strong sort of environmental ethic out there just caused many people to think, well, there's probably a more sustainable way and perhaps less expensive way we can do this. And that's why a lot of these pilot projects began to be implemented. And here you get a sense of just what that looks like. They can really be quite attractive. You've got plants that are absorbing this water, and a lot of sedges and rushes in there that are taking sediment out of the water. So it's cleaning the water as well as limiting the amount of water that ultimately gets into the system.
Yes, stop on that one.
Yes.
And talk a bit more about the types of plants that
Sure.
one thinks about for this, and why you're thinking about those plants
Sure,
as
okay.
compared to say, perennials.
Just
well, these are
anything.
perennials. Let me change that to the kind of perennials that we think about, which are shorter roots.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's a great question. The primarily what's being used are sedges and rushes. There are quite a few other plants that also can get used. And in fact, if anybody wants to look into it, if you Google the Portland Bureau of Environmental Services, you'll get to their website where their stormwater manual lists all the sort of approved plants for their rain gardens towards the end of that manual.
Okay, say that again so people get that.
It's the the Bureau of Environmental Services for the city of Portland. And if you Google that, you'll get to their homepage, and you should see on there's a link to their stormwater manual, sort of design guidelines for stormwater facilities, green facilities. And I mention that because there are dozens of plants that are used in these things. However, the ones that tend to be used most often are sedges and rushes. And as you indicated, Patsy, I mean, one of the reasons is that these native plants, which sedges and rushes are, tend to have very deep root systems, remarkably deep. I mean, sometimes
tell them how deep.
6, 8, 10, 12 feet, some of them. And, in fact, a lot of native plants, 80 or 90% of the biomass of the plant is going to be below ground, as compared to bluegrass lawn, which might have a root system of maybe 3 or 4 inches or something like that. So these plants have been just sort of engineered by nature, to do this. They suck a lot of water up, but they also sort of burrow down into the soil and create these channels that water can kind of travel down through and percolate into the soil through.
And for us, in our part of the world, with our aquifer, this is really important, because when it goes down through the rock and everything and gets down to our aquifer, it's really started cleaning up a lot, and it pulls a lot of water down back into the aquifer. Absolutely.
You get a sense here of just some of the things that they've done in this particular rain garden. They can be very attractive. Most of the maintenance in this particular rain garden is done by the neighbors who live there. That's a lot of people ask about maintenance, in these conversations.
Yes, absolutely.
And in this particular case, the neighborhood just loved the idea so much they've kind of adopted these things, and maintenance is just kind of happening on people walk down the sidewalk and they see a cup or something in there, they bend over and pick it up and take it home and throw it away. There are other areas throughout Portland where there's a little less ownership. Maybe it's in more of a commercial area or something like that. And in those kinds of situations, Portland has determined that they end up spending about $1.25 a square foot a year on these facilities. And what's happening is that they'll send a crew of 2 people out there, about 4 times a year, quarterly or so, and they're cleaning them out and shoveling sediment out of them and things like that. But in my conversations with the folks out there, it really is not that intensive a maintenance program. And they've got a number of them that have been in place for 5 and 7 years that they have yet to just come in and completely replace. I sort of wonder if at some point they have to completely dig them out, but they haven't found that to be necessary yet, apparently.
And it's probably far less than having to go back in and put in new infrastructure, which is where you started your story.
Right.
And I'm sure the problem is similar in Portland as it is here. A lot of the basement flooding here happens from many aspects, and one of those aspects is the old tiling systems that downspouts used to go into and then feed into the infrastructure. Well, if the infrastructure is full, it's going back into the tiling system, which then adds to the supersaturation of the soil, and so it's just gets into the basement from many cracks and crannies and drains and basement toilets and things of that nature. So again, just to underline what you're saying is the more we hold it back out of the infrastructure, allowing the infrastructure to empty out in these heavy storms, it just helps. And
yes,
it helps. And again, for the people locally, there are 2 rain gardens in the community now. One is a rain garden that's been put on the University of Illinois campus, very near Allen Hall. And it's been working quite nicely, keeping an area that was constantly flooded during rain. And then another one I've recently learned about that's put in at Lincoln Land Legal Services. And it's my understanding that the Extension Master Gardeners helped work on that. So we have two public examples of rain gardens if you're curious to go look at. How they design. They can be designed in many different ways.
Absolutely.
And but here are some examples. And one last thing, something I've also just recently learned, Rock Island is now so tuned to the use of rain gardens that they have 4 designs, and they will come in and put them in on people's property.
Okay.
Again, with that thought process of what you brought up about Portland, that it costs them less to do something like that than figure out how they were going to rip up a street and put in new infrastructure. It's much it costs to do it, but it's much less cost.
Exactly, and the slide that's on the screen right now is some information that was shared with Kevin Perry, or Kevin Perry out in Portland shared this with me, that indicates some of the sort of the vital signs, as he calls them. But this particular rain garden, this Northeast Siskiyou Green Street rain garden, was $17,000. And just as a point of reference,
it is nothing compared to a new pipe.
Absolutely. And one of there are mechanical devices, as the engineering and design community refers to them, that do a lot of what these rain gardens are designed to do. Some of the commercial names for these are like Vorceptor and Aquaswirl. But it's basically a big concrete structure that water flows into. It sort of swirls around inside, and the activity within the inside of that cleans the water and takes out a lot of the stuff that travels into the unit with it. So, it's gonna separate out cans and cigarette butts and sediment and all kinds of crazy things, diapers, all the things that sort of end up in these. Well, those units, just to give you a sense, are commonly $30,000 or $40,000. It seems remarkable that it ought to cost that much, but that's often what's budgeted for those. And those then periodically will have to be cleaned out. A lot of water is being directed to a single point, and so they very quickly will fill up with stuff. And the thing that cleans them out is a big Vorceptor truck, which it looks like a huge garbage truck, but it's got this giant sort of vacuum hose on it that a technician will stick down into that Aquaswirl and suck up all that stuff with. So, the device itself is perhaps $40,000. These trucks cost, I don't know, probably $500,000.
It's a thing you want to share with other communities.
Yeah, exactly. But you think about that versus, using natural systems, and to me, that's where you start to think, gosh, if we can just do this naturally, which is the way that it used to be done, that's the way our Earth, was sort of made, then you've got an opportunity to save an awful lot of money, it appears.
It does appear that way. Do you have... am I leaping you ahead too fast on your your project? You talked about another project in Indiana.
Yes, I'll kind of go get to the end. It's towards the end of this series of slides.
You're showing how they're built, though.
Yes, these images are from. You mentioned earlier the idea of sort of a rain garden on kind of the sidewalk side, as opposed to a curb bump out.
Well, I'm being my show. I can ask the questions, right kind of thing, because the area in which I live in Champaign, where we're working on this issue, one of the ideas is a series of rain gardens down one of the streets that happens to be geographically a bowl. And it collects a lot, and one of the things that people are beginning to talk about is cooperation. So they have a series of rain gardens in the curbings. Another is they're going to open John Street to put a new pipe in, and when John Street is open, what about a system of cisterns underneath the curbings?
Okay.
So if all of you in the area, our drainage district, are watching, here's the chance to hear the answer to those possibilities of how you can, are those feasible, and if so, how do you go about accomplishing those things.
Well, yes, I think they're feasible, and there's so many different ways, of sort of dealing with water. I think you mentioned the cisterns, and that's a very effective way to sort of contain and slow an awful lot of water. It tends to be very expensive,
Right, you wouldn't do it unless the street was already open.
Correct, yeah, and you had a pretty substantial budget for it. Those systems, in very heavily developed urban areas, many times there isn't room to do some sort of detention facility, and so you end up with essentially cisterns, but ways of storing water maybe under a parking lot serving a building. And those can be, you can very easily spend $500,000 on something like that. And so those are possibilities. You just have to have the room and the money for it.
And again, there's two examples in the community where they've done that on the sign. One is the parking lot at the new library, and the other is the church that I mentioned, where they put in the permeable concrete, and they put in a cistern which is controlled, so it then releases the water slowly after the big rush of water.
Right,
doing
after the peak is passed.
After the peak is passed, but those are larger surfaces that are draining into it.
Absolutely. And the image on the screen here is just an example of where those rain gardens have sort of been designed inboard, I guess, as opposed to like a curb bump out. It's sort
a bump out kind of design where you probably are looking at also as a little piece of traffic calming too, with the bump out.
Absolutely, and traffic calming. This offers a little bit of buffer between pedestrians and vehicles as well, and it makes a nice streetscape and so forth. So that's another option. This one happens to be, I don't know if it's evident in the image or not, but a series of 4 of these or something like that. Water travels into them and then travels back out the other end, down the gutter line, and then back into the next one. So it's kind of this treatment train is one of the phrases that's been used a lot. But yes, kind of a cascade, and presumably, it's getting cleaner and cleaner as it moves through each one of these cells. So.
Well, that leads me into being able to ask you the question of the designing of parking lots so that the runoff doesn't go down into this underground cistern, but into bioswales, and where parking lot surfaces are permeable, as alternative ways of designing, like auto sale where,
Right.
blacktops, and we have a local farm and fleet that is acres of blacktop.
Right.
Talk about some alternatives that we could be thinking about on that.
Sure. Well, yeah. I mean, anywhere that you've got huge areas of pavement, you're going to have obviously a lot of runoff, and so the concern sort of heightens. And in particular, you mentioned car dealerships and things like that, but parking lots also. Water drips from the bottom, or oil, and other sort of fluids within the car drips from the bottom of cars onto this pavement, and one of the and that's referred to as non-point source pollutants, and that's a big part of the problem. In that initial sort of peak of a rainstorm, that's when in the first 5 minutes or half inch to an inch of rain that falls, that contains a lot of these non-point source pollutants. So anything that can be done to sort of capture that before it gets farther downstream, it's a good thing to be doing. Permeable pavement will do that to a certain extent. Sand filters, if water is going through a pavement section and through sort of a rock storage area and then into sand, that'll filter a lot of that out. But also, the use of bioswales, as you said. We've got a project in Shelbyville, Indiana, for an orthopedic clinic that's under construction right now that uses a combination of permeable pavement and a bioswale. So,
and why don't you explain a bioswale?
Sure. It's essentially just a depression in the ground, low enough that it can receive water either coming out of a pipe from somewhere or just simply, through the base of the pavement section. And they tend to be 2 or 3 feet deep, and designed to capture a certain amount of water. There are calculations that can be done to figure out how big to make them. But quite often, you're excavating out the existing soil that's there, and putting in sort of a manufactured soil mix that's often a combination of sand and soil and compost. And everybody uses a little bit different sort of mixture, but it's intended to be more permeable than the soils that are there. And then within that growing medium, you're planting, again, many times native plants that are sort of designed by nature to absorb a lot of this water and slow it down. So
it makes for a very attractive parking area.
Absolutely.
Cuts it up very nicely.
Yes. And it's not, if that was lawn, it would have to be maintained, mown every week and a half or something like that. So you're not mowing a lawn. There's certainly maintenance that's involved, but it really reduces sort of all the energy needed to maintain, what would otherwise be maybe lawn or just ornamental landscaping.
And you talk about the pollutants that are brought off the street. I thought about that yesterday in that great gush of rain water, and mention to the viewers, if you are have more curiosity about this, go to the City of Madison, Wisconsin city homepage, and they have Friends of 1,000 Rain Barrels. And the reason for that is they don't have the flooding problems that we have here. Their concern is the 5 lakes that surround Madison, and the concern is exactly what you have just talked about, and that is all the pollutants that are being washed right into those lakes in their big rains. And as a community, they have taken it upon themselves to figure out ways to clean the water before it gets into the lake. Not to keep it out of the lake, but to do that cleaning.
Water quality.
You just described so very nicely.
Well, you asked earlier about the project in
absolutely.
in Indiana that is kind of near and dear to our hearts. And the image that you're seeing is sort of a contextual plan of Miller Showers Park, which is a 9-acre park in Bloomington, Indiana. And
you said very near the university.
Very near Indiana University. And the park serves essentially as a gateway into the community. So it's notable for a number of reasons, because it's a gateway. Also, half of the water from downtown Bloomington, which is about 180 acres, passes through this 9-acre piece of property before sort of going on, downstream to Cascade Creek.
So water runs downhill.
Yes, it does over there, just like it does here.
Right.
And this kind of represents, this is a little bit larger contextual map, but the very large green area there on the map is Cascades Park, which is an old WPA era park. And then the small sort of sliver on the left side of the screen there, kind of a triangular shape, really is almost a giant median between 2 one-way streets leading into and out of downtown, is Miller Showers Park. The park looked like that in well, up until about 2001 when construction started, but it was essentially a large kind of depression between these 2 one-way streets, a meandering ditch that ran through it, and just some disorganized trees. It just wasn't really a design space. And the problem was that all this water from downtown Bloomington was entering this space at the south end of the park, and really just blasting through it on its way to Cascades Creek. And very little in the way of water quality treatment was happening. There wasn't much to slow the water, so it was moving through there very quickly, and taking along with it all the non-point source pollutants from downtown, and delivering them to this.
And was it causing a great deal of erosion?
Yeah, a lot of erosion on the banks of this ditch that ran through it, a regulated drain. There was some existing artwork within the park that's on the screen now. 2 beautiful pieces that we ended up saving and sort of providing new settings for. But the idea behind the redesign of the park was to clean and slow the water, store it, incorporate these existing sculptures, relocate all the utilities that were currently in the park to the outside of the park. There were some electrical lines and storm lines and so forth. And really create, again, an appropriate gateway for the city of Bloomington, and something that said something about their how they feel about the environment. And this is the overall plan of the park. There are some sort of plan enlargements here that give you a better sense of some of the detail. At to the left of the image is the south end of the park, and you'll see kind of a long, thin element there that's a pier. That is where the vast majority of the water enters the park. There's a big box culvert associated with that pier.
Why don't you describe a box culvert?
Sure. It's just a large concrete pipe, essentially a square concrete pipe. In this case, it was about 6 feet by 8 feet, so it could convey a tremendous amount of water. And it receives water from a lot of different sort of pipes and things like that are delivering it there. And then within that culvert, it's designed in a way that removes a lot of things that the water is carrying with it. Again, those suspended solids. So the water in this particular design enters this basin at the south end. A lot of suspended solids settle out of the water there. And then it moves through a series of chambers, again, much like the things that the city of Portland has done, just on a larger scale. In fact, we refer to this as Indiana's largest rain garden, kind of a rain garden on steroids. But as the water moves through these different chambers, it's passing through aquatic plants that are taking up a lot of the pollutants in the water.
It's so hard for us who do not have your educational background to imagine that plants can do such a good job of cleaning things and actually cleaning the water so we could even drink it.
Yeah, it is amazing. I mean, they have an incredible ability to just kind of suck things out of the water and really do something that we have to spend millions and millions of dollars on equipment and technology to sort of facilitate. Plants already do a great deal of that, so it's just a matter of sort of using them in an effective way. And it can be, this is a water quality treatment facility, essentially. It's a stormwater treatment facility.
So it's a cleaning machine.
It is, and it's a public park, and so the image that you're seeing there is the pier down at the south end of the park. We really were very intentional in creating things that were aesthetically pleasing. Again, it's a gateway into the community, so we wanted it to have an aesthetic that was representative of the design vocabulary that's common in Bloomington, and picks up on a number of WPA era structures farther north in Cascades Creek Park. So. Going the wrong way.
Did you, it's hard to do direct calculation, but do you have, from your project, did you do any ballpark calculations on what this approach saved the city as compared to what we sometimes call the old-fashioned, just solely engineering solution?
That's a good question, and it's tough to say exactly how much money would have been saved, because otherwise you'd sort of have to design a complete stormwater management facility to understand the difference. However, it's not terribly uncommon for stormwater management, cleaning facilities that are using machines and settlement basins and technology and so forth to cost $20 or $30 million. There are communities that are getting ready to spend $50 million on things like that. By comparison, this park cost about $5.3 million, that's still a lot of money, but it's a lot less than 50. From that standpoint, it seems like a very wise thing to consider, from a master planning standpoint for any community. How can perhaps existing parks be used to do this? Or, just a whole system of rain gardens, community-wide can sort of add up to the, same kind of cumulative effect that this would have. And there are some tests that have been done on this. There's an IU student a number of years ago, a biology student.
Indiana University student.
Yes,
Indiana
assuming. University.
I'm assuming.
Yes, a student who was doing a senior project actually studied the water quality and was trying to sort of determine whether or not this design was effective, and found that, in fact, it was, and it was removing fecal coliform and ammonia and nitrates and total suspended solids, which are a lot of the kind of measuring sticks of water quality.
Right.
And removing as much as 50, 60, and 70% of those kinds of things. So it's really quite dramatic, and it's nice now that thanks to the work in Portland and work that this individual, this student, did at IU, we're beginning to get a pretty significant body of data that allows us to kind of objectively analyze the efficacy of doing these kinds of things.
It is. Let me phrase the question this way. Sometimes it's very hard to create the right environment for a paradigm shift within the decision makers in a community to move in this direction as compared to the engineering solution that there's more comfort level because they've done it years and years and years. So what were the circumstances that made it this project become available for your firm and then actually come to fruition?
That's a great question, and Bloomington is a unique place, and much like Urbana and Champaign, as a university community, it is progressively minded, and there are a lot of people down there who care an awful lot about the environment and quality of life, and that sort of thought process manifests itself in throughout the city administration as well. So when we had the opportunity to work on this project, the city had already determined that they wanted this park to be a big piece of green infrastructure. That wasn't something that we had to convince them to do, and that's a very nice position to be in, because more often than not, we're in the position of having to try and convince someone to try something that's very different. And in this particular case, the project was a joint effort between the utilities department and the parks department.
Okay.
And they cooperated throughout, and there were a lot of complexities that arose as a result of that relationship. But because they were willing to sort of join together and realize that green infrastructure is a place where their interests overlapped, the project was able to happen, and we were fortunate to work on with a very talented group of firms. We weren't the only firm that worked on it. There's a great engineering firm, R.W. Armstrong, that worked on it, and a firm called JF New, sort of an ecological specialist. And so it takes a lot of smart people, Not trying to say that that's me, but I need a lot of smart people, surrounding me to do these kinds of projects, because they can be very complicated. You're dealing with awful large amounts of water, sort of complicated, chemical issues associated with what kinds of pollutants you're trying to pull out of the water and so forth. So it really was a great team effort involving a lot of people, but it really started with the city just sort of recognizing that this is something we want to do because we want to say something as a community about how we feel about the environment, how we feel about water quality, how we feel about quality of life, and this solved a lot of those issues.
If the viewers wanted to have a chance to look at this project more in depth, would they find the project on the Ratio Architects website or the City of Bloomington, Indiana website?
I believe we have information about it on our website, which is www.ratioarchitects.com. I don't know whether the City of Bloomington, to what extent they have information about it, but certainly if anyone has an interest in learning more about it, I'd be happy to speak with them. And you can get to it if you wanted to visit it by going down State Road 37 in Indiana and taking the College Avenue exit. And if you take that exit, you'll be led right to the park as a sort of a gateway into the community.
The next time Illinois plays Indiana,
There you go. Leave an hour earlier. And
yeah, right. You've shared a lot of information and a lot of ideas. Do you have any other resources that you'd like to share with our viewers?
Well, certainly, the City of Portland is a great resource.
And why don't you remind people of what you suggested they go to
Sure.
for that?
It was Portland has something called the Bureau of Environmental Services. And if you Google that, you'll get to their homepage, and from that homepage, there's a number of links and different documents that would probably prove to be pretty interesting.
Okay.
Ratio's website has a number of our projects on it. I have a blog that can be accessed through the website as well, and I tend to think a lot about water quality and write about water quality, so that may be interesting.
So how do they find your blog? By going to Ratio Architects website?
Yes, go to our homepage, and up in the sort of upper right-hand corner, there's a link to the blogs. Yeah, so
that's outstanding. And I'll share with our viewers something that I just learned about this past week. The Center for Neighborhood Technologies, which is located in Chicago, and I also shared this with John earlier, has a very interesting website, and that's www.cnt.org. And then within that website, there is a subset of information specifically for developers, which gives you some calculations and calculators on the differential of savings if you use some of these approaches that John just described to us. And that one is no www, just greenvalues.cnt.org, and that's the only website that I found where they have this type of calculator. Doesn't mean others don't exist. It's the only one I have found so far. John, thank you so much. You've shared so much with our community. We have serious flooding problems throughout the community, and I know our viewers will capture and take some of these ideas back to their individual neighbors and neighborhoods to start working on solving some of these issues.
Great.
Thank you for watching today, and remember, planning matters.